All right, welcome back. We are going to continue on with our color theory practice worksheet. This is part 2. We left off on saturation and we are dulling down our colors. We left off last time by dulling it with gray, and now we are going to continue on to dull it with its complement. So the directions are on this grid. You're going to have 100% hue on your left, so we're still using green for this whole entire worksheet. So for this rectangle, I'm just going to paint this 100% green. It's fully saturated. Okay, and then I'm going to wash my brush out really good and dry it. Wipe all the water off. Dry it on a towel. Make sure you are using a flat paintbrush for this exercise. Okay. All the way on the right, I'm going to put 100% of my complementary color. Okay, so how do I find that? Well, here's the color wheel. Okay, here's my green. To find your complementary color, you want to draw a straight line across the center of the color wheel, and there will be the complementary color. If you look on the back of my color wheel, you can see that I've got this really nice twisty thing, so I can see here's an arrow that points to my complement color. It also shows split complement, triad, tetrad, and we'll get into that later. But green and red are complements, so I'm going to paint red in this rectangle all the way on the right. You want to make sure that you have a really clean brush so you don't have any green mixed in with that. So artists use complementary colors a lot. When you put two complementary colors next to each other, they act as opposites and they really make one another stand out, like black and white. They are also used to dull down colors, just like gray. Okay, so here in the middle, we're going to mix about 50-50% of the green and the complement. Okay, so I'm going to take some of my pure green over here still, pick it up and put it in a new clean spot on my palette. And I'm going to pick up about the same amount of the red, and it's going to end up making this kind of brown neutral color. And that's what I'm shooting for, it should be. Okay, so this is 50-50%, approximately. Mix it all together really well. And I'm gonna clean my brush. So my paintbrush is nice and clean too. And make sure it's dried off. And then pick up this 50-50% of red and green and paint that here in the middle. Looks really dark right now, but it will lighten up to be a nice brown. all complementary colors will give you some kind of a brown. Okay, now instead of making a totally new section, I'm going to keep this 50-50% in the middle, and I'm going to kind of just divide this in half. Okay, so here's some, and then here's some more over here. And I'm just scooping this with my brush. Okay, you can use your palette knife, or you can use your paintbrush. On one of these sides, I'm going to add a lot more red and mix that. And on the other side, I'm going to add a lot more green and mix that. And that's going to give me my two other rectangles that I need to fill out. I'm going to do this 75% hue, 25% complement first. So I'm going to scoop up a lot of green and mix that in with my brown that I made. But I'm only going to keep it on this top part. I don't want it to go over the whole section. Okay. Once that's mixed really well, grab your clean paintbrush, make sure you wash it out, and paint this rectangle in between your pure green and your brown in the middle. Okay. I'm going to wash out my brush and dry it. And then in the bottom area where I still have that brown that I mixed first, I'm going to grab a whole bunch of red and mix it in to this area, into that brown. And then I'm going to take my clean, dry paintbrush and fill in this last rectangle in between the brown and my red. And there we have it. Okay, so let's review. Okay, flip all the way back to the top. So properties of color, we have value. Tints are light values of a color. You start with white and mix your color into the white. Shades are dark values of a color. You start with your color and mix black into that. And then saturation is how bright or dull a color is. You can get different saturations of colors by mixing tones, which is dulling a color with gray. So you start with your color and you add gray. And then you can get less saturation by mixing in the complement color. So you start with your color and then you add your complement into that. Okay. The next part, if you look at your worksheet, this is the next page, the color harmony schemes, but we're going to skip that and come back to it on part 3. And we are going to go on to the painting tips and techniques. Okay, so for this first worksheet, you were just filling in solid color in all of those spaces. Now let's look at the last page, which is the tips and techniques. And on here, this talks about the anatomy of a paintbrush. So up at the top, you can read through this. Okay, and I'll hold this paintbrush up so you can see it. So we've got the handle, which is the part that you hold. You have the ferrule, which is the metal part that connects the handle to the bristles. In the ferrule, the bristles are glued in and then they are crimped, usually shut. So they're glued and then crimped. Because they are glued on to the brush, it's really important that you do not leave your paintbrushes sitting in your water all the time. What happens when you do that is that usually most handles are made out of wood, so the wood swells and then they'll crack. So you can see I've got a little crack in this paintbrush because it's old, and it's not a really good paintbrush. Okay, but also the bristles will start to fall out. So you want to take good care of your paintbrushes. If you buy really nice ones, it's super important that you take good care of them because you're spending a lot of money on them. Now, if it's a cheap, cruddy paintbrush, you don't have to be as neat, I guess, but try to be mindful of that anyways, regardless of, okay? In the bristles, we have the heel, which is the part that connects to the ferrule. It's the lowest part. The belly of the bristles is really like the main body. And then you have the toe, which is where you drag the paint and you paint in and cut in lines. You don't really want your paint to be farther up than like midway and higher into the ferrule. You want it to be midway in the belly and down towards the toe, which is why a lot of artists use palette knives to mix, so they're not wasting paint. Any paint that you put here and higher up, it just gets wasted. You can't paint with that part of your brush because the brush can only flex so much, and that's the part where it pushes and glides the paint around onto the canvas or paper. Okay, so that's the anatomy of a paintbrush. These are the different types of paintbrushes that there are, and there's a few more out there other than what's listed here. But just in general, anything that's flat is going to be used to fill in spaces, and anything that is round is going to be used for lines. So you do not want to use a round brush to fill in any kinds of shapes or flat spaces. And there's just a little bit more information on there that you can read. On the bottom, here's some different techniques that we're going to do together. Okay, the first one is layering, and I'm just going to use some of the mixed up paint that I had from my demonstration on the first page, and I'm going to start in the layering, and I want to try to fill in this first circle on the left as best as I can. And I'm using tempera. Okay, tempera paint's water soluble. You can mix water in with it to dilute it, but then it becomes more like a watercolor property. I don't want you to be diluting the paint for this worksheet. Okay, so, and then I'm going to come back to this one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this circle dry, and then I'm going to come back and paint the next circle, and I'm going to let that circle dry, and then I'm going to come back and paint this third one. Okay, so for right now, I'm going to go on to pressing. So this is paint, like flat painting, and layering is going to show you how the paint reacts when you layer paint on top of each other. So for this one, I'm just going to use my paintbrush like a stamp, and I'm just going to press down. I'm not going to drag it at all. And I kind of mixed a couple different colors together without cleaning my brush. So it's creating this really nice, varied effect. You can also use just the toe to press down and create textures. Okay. Edging and cutting in is what we were doing on those rectangles. So it's pushing your toe of the paintbrush along the contour of the shape that you want to fill in, and then trying to follow the contours as much as possible so that you don't have a whole lot of back and forth brush strokes being shown. So I'm going to point my toe towards the line, and then I'm going to move my hand and come back. You don't want to try to fill in with the heel facing wherever you're trying to cut in on the edge, because you'll probably go outside of your shape. You always want to have your toe pointed to the outline of the contour. And normally I turn my paper a lot, so I'm trying to do that. It's okay. Or you can turn your hand. It's just harder to do that. And keep it straight. Okay. All right, blending. Here in this little space, I want you to try to create the implied form of a sphere. So we're going to do that by blending, and blending you're going to do on the paper while the paint is still wet. So I'm going to start with white, and I'm going to paint that here in the middle. I want to try to follow the same contours. And actually I'm going to give like a whole layer of just white. And then I'm going to come in with a little bit of my lighter green tint. And while it's still wet, I'm going to try to get them to blend together. And then I'm going to come in with a little bit more pure green. And blend that in. The key here is you've got to work kind of quick because tempera dries very fast. But you can always go back in with more white and lighten it up. And keep mixing. So I'm going to get some more white and come back and blend those all in together. So now I have this really nice implied form of a sphere. Okay, dry brush is a technique where you are going to apply some paint, dip into the paint, and then you want to kind of blot off as much of that paint as possible. You can do it on the side of your palette to get it get the bristles really dry, or you can do it on, you can blot it on your cloth or paper towel, whatever you have. And this is for making really rough kinds of textures. You can hear it when you paint with this technique. Okay, the last, actually let's go back and do another layer here. I'm going to use my gray and paint over. So you should notice when you paint back on top of that first circle, it'll rehydrate that green because tempera is not a permanent paint. And it might blend some of that together. Okay, so I'm going to leave that. I'm going to go down here to this painterly one. Painterly means that you mix and use kind of bolder brush strokes and more texture directly on the paper. You don't pre-mix everything. There's a lot less control, but there's a lot more expression. I'm going to go outside of, so I'm not cleaning my brush in between here. I'm just grabbing some more paint. Each time and filling in those spaces. So all painters have different ways of making marks and they have different styles. You want to try to figure out what's your style and what you're trying to match. So you can combine pressing and lots of different kinds of mark making here. Okay. Let's go back to this last layer. It's pretty much dry. Okay. So, why are these important? Okay. Paintings, it's really important to layer when you're working on your work. You should work from the background to the foreground. And that's so you don't have these little fuzzy kind of halo spots around your objects and your shapes that you have. If you paint the back fully, okay, then you've filled in all of that space. But with tempera, it's water soluble, so when it gets wet again, it gets rehydrated. So you don't always want to paint all of your spaces completely in the background, because if you put a really dark color down first and then you try to put a lighter color on top of it, a lot of times you won't be able to get as bright as you need to. So you've got to consider what is the best decision and how that you need to paint whatever you're trying to paint. Okay, texture is really important. How can you get that with your brush? You can try a lot of different kind of pressing techniques or painterly. When you're trying to smoothly fill in an object, you always want to edge or cut in with pushing the toe of your paintbrush, and that's the bristles, towards the line. So you have to always follow the edge, cut in. Okay, And then blending, if you want to show gradient of value, you've got to do that when it's wet and you've got to work quick. Don't worry if you go outside of your edges because you can probably just paint over that. And if it's not what you originally intended, well then try to do some kind of texture in that area to make it look like it was intentional with dry brush or painterly or something else. Okay, and that is it for part 2. We will come back very shortly to finish up the last part of this worksheet.